horrible happened to that girl last summer. Some dreadful...
In the early hours of July 23, 1966, New York City was already awake. Taxis moved through empty avenues, lights burned behind apartment windows, and the city continued doing what it always does, unaware that one of Hollywood's most fragile legends was lying alone in silence. Montgomery Clift was not in a hospital. There was no emergency call. No final performance. No dramatic farewell. He was in his Manhattan apartment, a few rooms away from the life that once defined him, surrounded not by cameras or applause, but by medication bottles, quiet walls, and the long aftermath of a career that had slowly collapsed under its own weight. To the world, the cause of death would be simple: a heart attack. But for those who knew Clift's final years, the painkillers, the insomnia, the isolation, the question was never what happened. The real question was when it truly began. Because Montgomery Clift did not die suddenly. He faded. And in his final hours, there was no one left to witness the moment when one of the most beautiful faces in Hollywood history finally slipped out of view. What really happened in those last hours? And how did a man who once redefined screen acting end his life unheard, unseen, and almost forgotten? The news broke quietly, almost cautiously, as if even the headlines were unsure how loudly they were allowed to speak his name. Montgomery Clift was dead at 45. There were no crowds gathering outside hospitals. No flashing sirens captured by cameras. No stunned award ceremonies pausing mid-broadcast. Just a brief announcement. A cause listed in a single line. A photograph pulled from archives showing a face that no longer existed. Hollywood reacted with a strange kind of restraint. Studio statements were polite, distant, almost clinical. Former collaborators offered respectful condolences, but few spoke in detail. It was as if Clift's death confirmed something the industry had already accepted years earlier, that he belonged to a different era, one that had quietly closed its doors without ceremony. And yet, beneath the surface, the shock was profound. For an entire generation of actors, Montgomery Clift was not just a star. He was a turning point. Before him, male leads were defined by certainty, dominance, and control. Clift introduced vulnerability. Hesitation. Pain that did not need to be explained out loud. He made silence expressive. He made stillness dangerous. That was why his death unsettled people who had never met him. Because the contrast was impossible to ignore. A man who taught cinema how to feel, dying in emotional isolation. A performer who made audiences lean forward, disappearing without an audience at all. In newspapers, his obituary struggled to find the right tone. Some focused on the brilliance of his early performances. Others lingered uncomfortably on the phrase, declining health. Very few addressed the deeper truth, that Clift's final years had been defined by a long, visible unraveling that no one had known how to stop. Fans reacted differently. Letters arrived at studios. Old films were replayed late at night on television. Viewers noticed, perhaps for the first time, how young he looked in those early roles, how alive. And the question began to form, slowly and quietly, in the public mind. How does someone go from that, to this? Because this was not the death of a recluse unknown to the world. This was the death of a man whose face had once been everywhere. And if his end felt muted, it was only because the tragedy had stretched out for so long that the final moment barely made a sound. To understand why Montgomery Clift's death felt inevitable, and why it still feels unfinished, we have to go back. Not to his final apartment. Not even to the years just before his death. We have to return to the beginning. To the making of a star who never wanted to be one, and to the early choices that shaped a life far more fragile than anyone realized. Long before the pills, before the silence, before the apartment in Manhattan, Montgomery Clift was a child shaped by instability. He was born into a family that moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough to feel rooted. His mother believed fiercely in refinement, discipline, and control. She drilled languages into him, curated his manners, and pushed him toward culture and performance with an intensity that left little room for childhood softness. Even early on, Clift learned how to observe rather than belong. Acting came not as an escape, but as a structure. On stage, he knew where to stand. He knew what was expected. The uncertainty of real life could be replaced by scripted truth. By the time he reached Broadway, Clift was already different from the men Hollywood usually celebrated. He wasn't loud. He wasn't dominant. He didn't project confidence, he projected tension. Directors noticed that the camera seemed to lean toward him, drawn by something unresolved in his face. When he arrived in Hollywood in the late 1940s, the industry didn't quite know what to do with him. He rejected long-term studio contracts, refused to be molded, and insisted on choosing his own roles. It was an act of independence that bordered on self-sabotage in an era built on obedience. But the screen loved him anyway. In films like Red River, A Place in the Sun, and From Here to Eternity, Clift introduced a new kind of masculinity. His characters were conflicted, emotionally exposed, often uncomfortable inside their own bodies. He didn't act toward the audience. He acted inward, forcing viewers to follow. The success was immediate and overwhelming. Critics praised his realism. Fellow actors watched him closely, studying how little he did, and how much it conveyed. He became a symbol of artistic integrity in an industry increasingly driven by image. But the very qualities that made him extraordinary also left him dangerously exposed. Clift struggled with his identity in a Hollywood that demanded clarity. His private life was guarded, not out of mystery, but out of fear. He drank to quiet his nerves. He slept poorly. He absorbed criticism deeply, even when it was subtle. And then, in 1956, everything changed. Late one night, after leaving a dinner party at a friend's home, Clift crashed his car into a telephone pole. The accident shattered his face and nearly killed him. Surgeons reconstructed his jaw, but the damage went far beyond the physical. The man audiences had known no longer existed in the same way. Pain became constant. Prescription medications entered his daily life. The mirror became an enemy. Roles dried up or changed in tone. Directors who once waited for him began to move on. From that moment forward, Montgomery Clift's career, and his inner life, entered a slow decline. Not dramatic. Not sudden. Just steady. And by the time the world stopped watching closely, the conditions for his final hours were already in place. After the accident, Montgomery Clift never fully returned to the world he had once inhabited so effortlessly. Physically, he healed enough to work. Emotionally, he never did. The pain in his body was constant, his jaw, his teeth, his nerves, but the deeper damage was internal. The accident had taken away more than symmetry. It stripped him of confidence, stability, and the fragile sense of control he had relied on since childhood. Prescription painkillers, initially necessary, became routine. Routine became dependence. Clift's sleep collapsed. Nights stretched long and restless. Days blurred together. Alcohol entered the equation, not as a public vice, but as a private anesthetic. Friends noticed changes, the hesitations, the sudden mood shifts, the way his once precise focus drifted. Hollywood noticed too. Roles became less frequent, then less forgiving. Directors whispered that he was unreliable. Insurance companies grew cautious. The industry that had once praised his intensity now quietly recoiled from it. The same vulnerability that had electrified his performances was now seen as a liability. Clift felt the shift acutely. He was deeply self-aware, painfully so. He knew when people looked at him differently. He knew when sympathy replaced admiration. And he internalized it all, retreating further into isolation. There were moments of brilliance, performances that reminded audiences of who he had been, but they were increasingly overshadowed by concern. On set, he sometimes struggled to remember lines. Crew members noticed his hands shaking. His weight fluctuated. His voice softened, lost some of its former authority. Behind closed doors, his personal life unraveled further. Clift lived alone, maintaining distance even from those who cared about him. He avoided sustained relationships. Trust was difficult. Intimacy, even harder. The world felt unsafe, judgmental, unpredictable, and he responded by shrinking his own. By the early 1960s, the pattern was clear. He was no longer falling. He was descending. Doctors warned him about the strain on his heart. Friends urged him to slow down, to seek help, to step away. He listened politely. Rarely changed anything. The habits had hardened into survival mechanisms. What made this collapse especially cruel was its invisibility. There was no scandal splashed across headlines. No explosive incident that demanded intervention. Just a gradual erosion, health declining, opportunities narrowing, silence expanding. And in that silence, Montgomery Clift began to disappear from public consciousness long before his body followed. By the time he reached the final months of his life, he was no longer fighting to regain what he had lost. He was simply trying to endure. And endurance, when sustained too long, becomes exhaustion. In the weeks leading up to his death, Montgomery Clift's world had grown very small. There were no major projects on the horizon. No demanding schedules. No premieres to prepare for. The momentum that once pulled him forward had slowed to a crawl, leaving him alone with his routines and his thoughts. He spent most of his time in his Manhattan apartment, a quiet space that offered privacy but also reinforced isolation. Friends described him as withdrawn, tired, and increasingly fragile. Conversations were shorter. Plans were vague. He spoke less about the future and more about his body, how exhausted he felt, how difficult it was to sleep, how the pain never seemed to fully recede. Medication remained a constant presence. So did alcohol, though never in the loud, reckless way that tabloids love to sensationalize. This was not self-destruction on display. It was erosion. A slow wearing down of a system that had been under stress for years. There were moments when he seemed almost at peace. He reread books. He watched films. Sometimes his own, though that could be difficult. Seeing his younger face on screen was not comforting. It was a reminder of distance, not just time, but identity. People who checked in sensed something was wrong but struggled to articulate it. Clift had always been introspective. Always sensitive. His quiet did not immediately signal crisis. It felt like continuity rather than warning. That is often how final weeks pass, not marked by alarms, but by normalcy just thin enough to conceal danger. In the days before his death, there were no dramatic statements. No cryptic notes. No public goodbyes. If there were fears or realizations, they remained internal. The man who once conveyed entire emotional landscapes with a single glance now kept his inner life carefully sealed. What is known is that his health was compromised. Years of medication, alcohol, and stress had taken a toll on his heart. Doctors had cautioned him before. Friends had worried quietly. But concern, without urgency, rarely changes outcomes. As the final day approached, nothing on the surface suggested it would be different from the many quiet days that had come before. And that, perhaps, is what made what followed so devastating. The final 24 hours of Montgomery Clift's life did not announce themselves. There was no scheduled meeting. No rehearsal to attend. No phone call that sounded like a goodbye. According to what is known, the day unfolded quietly, almost indistinguishably from the many that had come before it. Clift remained in his apartment, moving slowly, conserving energy. There were no visitors recorded. No public appearances. The city moved outside his windows, unaware that time inside that space was narrowing. Reports indicate that Clift had been feeling unwell. Fatigue was constant. His heart, already weakened by years of strain, medication, and alcohol, struggled under the accumulated pressure. What is clear is that he was alone, not in the dramatic sense of abandonment, but in the ordinary, dangerous way that isolation becomes invisible. As evening approached, there were no signs of urgency. No call for help. No emergency response racing through the night. Whatever discomfort he felt, he carried it quietly, as he had learned to do throughout his life. At some point during the night or early morning hours, Montgomery Clift suffered a heart attack. There was no witness to the moment itself. No one heard the silence fall. When he was later found in his apartment, the scene was stark and undisturbed. No evidence of struggle. No chaos. Just the stillness of a life that had reached its limit. The official cause of death was listed simply, coronary artery disease. But simplicity can be misleading. Because that final moment was not isolated. It was the endpoint of years of physical damage, emotional exhaustion, and chemical dependence. A body asked to endure too much for too long had finally stopped. There were no last words preserved for history. No dramatic final act to reinterpret. What remains instead is absence, the unanswered hours between the last known contact and the moment he was discovered. And in that absence, the questions linger. Was there a moment when he realized what was happening? Did he understand that this was the end? Or did it come quietly, without warning, as exhaustion finally overtook endurance? What is certain is that Montgomery Clift did not die as a public figure surrounded by spectacle. He died as he had lived in his final years, privately, inwardly, unseen. And when the news reached the world, the focus immediately shifted from the stillness of that apartment to the implications of what had been lost. The official explanation arrived quickly and, on paper, neatly. Montgomery Clift died of a heart attack. For authorities, there was little reason to look further. There were no signs of violence. No evidence of foul play. No unanswered calls demanding immediate inquiry. The death fit a pattern that, to doctors and investigators, seemed tragically logical: years of physical trauma, prolonged medication use, alcohol, and chronic stress converging into a single, fatal moment. But for those who had followed Clift's life closely, the conclusion felt incomplete. Not incorrect, incomplete. Because while the heart attack explained the mechanism of death, it did not explain the story behind it. Almost immediately, quiet questions began circulating among friends, colleagues, and fans. Not shouted accusations. Not conspiracy theories splashed across headlines. Just a subdued, persistent unease. Had his dependence on prescription drugs played a larger role than officially acknowledged? Were the long-term effects of his injuries and surgeries fully considered? Was his death truly sudden, or had it been approaching for far longer than anyone wanted to admit? Some close to Clift spoke privately about the toll that years of medication had taken on his body. Painkillers and sedatives had been part of his daily life for so long that the boundary between treatment and harm had blurred. Others pointed to his emotional isolation, the way he withdrew rather than asked for help, even when his health visibly declined. There were also uncomfortable truths Hollywood preferred not to examine too closely. Clift had been insured less frequently in his later years. Studios had quietly distanced themselves. Offers dried up not because of talent, but because of perceived risk. In that sense, the industry that had once celebrated his sensitivity had also contributed to his marginalization. And then there was the question no report could answer: intervention. Was there a moment when someone could have stepped in more forcefully? A friend, a doctor, an institution? Or had Clift's decline been so gradual that urgency never materialized until it was too late? Unlike other famous deaths, there was no single villain to blame. No dramatic reveal waiting in sealed files. The tragedy lay precisely in its ordinariness, in how a slow collapse can pass unnoticed when it unfolds behind closed doors. In the years that followed, Clift's death would be referenced often, but rarely examined deeply. It became a footnote rather than a case study. A quiet ending to a life that had once changed cinema forever. And that quiet, unresolved feeling is part of what continues to haunt his story. Because the absence of scandal does not mean the absence of tragedy. Sometimes it means the opposite. Montgomery Clift left this world without ceremony, but he did not leave it without impact. In the years after his death, something curious happened. His films did not fade. They grew sharper. Audiences revisiting his work noticed details that once felt subtle but now seemed devastatingly clear: the hesitation in his voice, the way his eyes carried conflict even in stillness, the sense that he was always listening to something no one else could hear. You could trace a direct line from Clift's performances to an entire generation of actors who followed. The vulnerability that once made him an outlier became the standard. His influence lived on in every performance that dared to be quiet, uncertain, emotionally exposed. And yet, his final years remained largely unspoken. Perhaps because they were uncomfortable. Perhaps because they forced an honest reckoning with how the industry treats sensitivity, how it celebrates it when it is profitable, and abandons it when it becomes inconvenient. Looking back from the perspective of his final hours, Montgomery Clift's life reads differently. Not as a rise and fall, but as a long negotiation between truth and survival. Acting gave him a language for emotion, but it could not protect him from pain. Fame gave him visibility, but not safety. In the end, there was no single moment that defined his death. No dramatic choice. No irreversible mistake. Just the cumulative weight of years lived under strain, endured quietly, until the body could no longer carry what the mind had been holding. That is what makes his story so unsettling. Because it reminds us that not all tragedies announce themselves with noise. Some unfold slowly, invisibly, in ordinary rooms, while the world looks elsewhere. Montgomery Clift did not die young in the way legends often do. He died worn down. And in that truth lies the most difficult lesson of all, that brilliance and sensitivity, without protection or care, can become vulnerabilities rather than strengths. His final hours passed in silence. But his legacy speaks, still. And if we listen closely enough, it asks us a simple, uncomfortable question. How many other voices are fading quietly, right now, while the world waits for something louder to notice?